The following is a recount of the Hawkins family history by Fred Douglas Hawkins on December the 9th, 1995.
If my memory serves me right, Arch Hawkins and Margaret Douglas were married January 1, 1915. A year later, on March the 3rd, their first son was born, Fred Hawkins. To the family, 6 children arrived, 3 boys and 3 girls. In about 1920, Dad moved with 40 head of horses and mules, freight wagons, and family belongings from Orland, California, through Red Bluff and east to Madeline Plains, where Dad and his younger brother Jim had purchased a homestead apiece of about 300 and some acres. Dad was 3 months on the road with 40 head of animals, trying to get there. And the pressure of it really got to Dad. Farm development was his business, and that was a new irrigation project that they were building. But the government, in all their surveying and all, forgot that they've got to have mountains high enough to shed a lot of water. And as a result, eventually, the project went bust because there was not water enough. But Dad moved up there with a contract to build 3 reservoirs, but they never got them full. And that was a mile-high country, frost every month in the year. So you couldn't even raise a garden. Hired men going along with them, putting them up at hotels and stuck in the mud. When they went through Bieber, the circus had been there the day before, and Dad had to double up all of his teams to get the wagons through the mud. Jim and Bertha went with 1 wagon and team ahead. Because they were lighter, they traveled a little faster. When Jim saw them coming, as you can imagine what it would be out across the plains, 40 head of horses and mules, Belgian stallion and registered mares and jacks and all of it. But during all of this trip, under all this pressure, Dad kept thinking, if I can get there, then I can rest. And Dad was a very high-strung individual. And Jim met him with the word that the cabin's built on another man's land, and that initially he wouldn't let him move it. But Dad's health kind of broke over that deal, so they shipped Dad on a stretcher back to Orland, California, where Mother and us kids were. See, I was born in '16, so I do not remember that, but the doctors told Dad he had to get completely away from horses and mules, because it bothered him. And so he went to Seaside, Oregon, and hired out as a salesman on International Correspondence School's education study on the job type of deal. He was never educated in that line, but he had some college in Kirksville, Missouri. But he stepped to the second highest salesman in the United States in an area that had never paid, even with professional men on it. So we wound up in Seaside. So the whole family went to Seaside. We were there for a year, and then his health leave of absence on the homestead was about to run out because the year was gone. The doctors had secured him a permit to get away from the homestead that long. So we moved back to Reno from Seaside, Reno, Nevada, where we'd be close to the homestead and eventually move on to it, even with Dad's health the way it was. We moved to Reno, and Mother had a bad heart attack there living in Sparks. So at any rate, we moved to Sparks, close to Reno. And Tommy, the 3rd boy, had infantile paralysis. They call it polio today, at the same time that Mother had the heart attack. Dad had to stay home and take care of the sick instead of getting out and making a living. But at any rate, we eventually moved to the homestead. Dad and Mother and 4 kids. Later on, Dolly and Althea were born on the homestead. By this time, I was somewhere around 6 years of age. But when we came back, hay was a real premium in that country, of course. When we came back, we couldn't hitch 10 head. Out of that 40 that went in there hitched, we couldn't, this big Belgian registered stallion turned him out in the greasewood and he starved to death. Never been out of a box stall in his life. Bertha, who is still alive in Ontario, was married to Jim while he was building cabins on the homestead. He got pneumonia, and she was in Orland, Bertha was, and she heard about him having pneumonia out there on that homestead, nobody taking care of him. She went up there and took care of him, nursed him back to health. Then they went to Alturas and were married there. Bertha's mother, the last I knew, they were still in Orland. So we came back, and Mother and us kids moved to the homestead from Reno. Mother and us kids set up housekeeping there on the homestead. And it was my job to gather sagebrush for heat and fuel. Because of frost every month in the year, you couldn't raise any garden. Dad kept on working to support the family. One humorous incident, when Dad came home, and he always came with a whole loaded back end of that old Dodge, loaded with groceries for Mother and us kids out on the homestead. We were 8 miles from town, and no roads to speak of at all, traveled by a pack horse. When the roads were good, well, the car could make it. One of us kids climbed up on his knee when he come in and was telling Dad how much we loved him, and he wanted to know why. He says, "'Cause you bring us some groceries." Dad was an intellectual, and he could, as a salesman from the practice, he could make you believe black was white when you're looking right at it. He could quote more scripture in 15 minutes than I ever will my whole lifetime. Very active, hard worker, and a good dad. That's about all you can say for that. Mother was one in a million. Very quiet, mild-mannered, peaceful, gentle person, an ideal mother. I never in my whole life ever heard any raising of voice or argument between Dad and Mother. No time. Mother was a hard worker and a very peaceable person. Dad was a hard worker. He was gone most of the time, out on a job trying to make a living for his family, which is the only way to do it. Very high-strung. And when the rest of us had all day's work and we'd play out, Dad eat a handful of raisins, go do another day's work. Dad, Dolly and Althea were born. Dolly, I remember when she was born on the homestead. Althea, I think Mother got to town. And I don't remember which town where Althea was born. The 2 girls were born while we were living on the homestead, and one of them, Dolly, was born there on the homestead. One of the neighbors went by one day. Dad and Mother had an agreement that they were going to Susanville to have Dolly for her birth. But one of the neighbors went by and told her husband, they were going by, said, "I just kind of feel like we ought to stop and see the Hawkinses." Well, he didn't want to. They wanted to get on to town and get the mail and hear from their daughter. But he did. And Mother was in the delivery pains when they arrived. And they sent across the valley to get another woman who was a professional at it, apparently, clear across the valley, or she sent her husband to get this other woman. They got her there in time to help out. So Dolly was born on the homestead, in this cabin. Now, I can remember us kids Well, we had to all go outside while all this Dolly's birth was born in the cabin. And I remember this couple that had come by had a high school daughter. I don't recall exactly how old she was. But at any rate, they got to teasing me about her. And see, I was only about, 12 years old. And they were teasing me, and I climbed up on top of a great big corner fence post to get away from all this teasing. I can remember sitting on top of that big fence post, and them teasing me about this girl. Out on the homestead alone, I had 2 kids to visit at the school, teacher's boy and girl, which were just a notch younger than I was. My job was to take the horses and cattle to the hills in the morning while I was in school, and then bring them back at night. And that was my job, was to take the stock to the hills and then bring them back with me at night from school, horseback. Mother's role was difficult, of course, with nothing but sagebrush to cook with. Venison and red Mexican beans is what we grew up on. We neighbored with Jim and Bertha, and one winter, Dad and Joy and Bert and I made the posts out of juniper, and that's hard stuff to handle. We made the posts and fenced 640-acre homestead. No, where did I get the 600? 300, I think it was closer to 320. I've forgotten. A lot of funny incidents happened. Us kids would go to school out through the sagebrush, horseback. Sometimes all 3 of us on one horse. Sometimes we'd take the cart. Dad had an old breaking cart out through the sagebrush. Wintertime, 4 foot of snow, frost every month of the year. But that's where we went to grade school, 6 miles and a quarter, out to the old Butte school. The teacher had took 5 kids to keep the school open. Teacher had a boy and a girl, just a notch younger than Joy and I. So Bert went when he's 5 years old to keep the school open. I remember one time we were going across, we were all 3 of us riding an old Bolly, an old work mare, and out across the plains, flat country, the spots of ice, and then humps of sagebrush and all. And we were riding along one day, and Mother had tucked Joy and Bert in with a horse blanket around their legs to keep them warm. 40 below zero in that country. This old mare stepped on the ice on the rear quarters and fell down behind. Well, when she hit the ground, of course, I rolled off. I was riding a rumble seat, 3 of us on one horse, and she fell down on the ice. She got up again and started off. Joy was still in the saddle, but Bert was hanging with his blankets, and his head bumping along on the ground, the old mare stepping and just missing his face with her hind feet. Well, I jumped up and caught the old mare and got her stopped and got him righted, and we went on to school. But another school incident, we were driving this big old breaking cart, and Dad had hammered into me that my responsibility was to get those kids home before dark. 40 below zero and 4 foot of snow. So it was my job to get the kids home. I was the oldest one. I went out one day after school to hitch up, get ready to come home, and all the kids jumped in and started rolling the cart back. When I would back the horse into the shafts, well, they'd roll the cart back, all of them together. And I'd go get the cart, and then they'd lead the horse up. Well, what was I going to do? My responsibility is to get those kids home. Yet I couldn't do it with them taking the cart and then the horse. Well, pretty soon, after a while, the teacher called her 2 kids, and they headed home. But Bert and Joy could still roll the cart back by climbing on the spokes. So I put a rope around Bert and tied him in the barn. Before I got hitched up, he got loose, and here he come again. So next time I tied the rope around his waist and threw it over a rafter and pulled his feet off the ground and tied him there. I'd forgotten that he'd had a bad hernia. When we got home, bouncing over that rough sagebrush and that hanging with that rope around his middle, he was a sick boy. So eventually we got home and all come out of it all in one piece anyway. Well, Dad always held a kind of a little court. And everybody on the circle would tell their side of the story. Then, after everybody else had spoke, the guilty guy, he could tell his side of the story. Dad sat on the bench. Boy, I knew I was in for it, for making that boy so sick. I come to my feet. See, I was only about 10 years old by this time. So I knew I was in for it. I was going to catch it for making him so sick. I come to my feet, a ball on the course, because I knew I was going to catch it. And I told Dad, I looked him right in the eye, and I said, you told me it was my job to get those kids home after school. And I tried. And the kids were rolling the cart back, and Bert and Joy and the teacher's kids, well, she come and got her kids and headed home, but I still couldn't do it without tying Bert up in the barn. They all told you I tied Bert in the barn, and I did. But they didn't tell you why I tied him in the barn. I didn't get that paddle that I was expecting. So, that was the early grade school years. And, in the meantime, Dolly and Althea were born while we were on the homestead. Every Saturday night while the old wash tub was set up in the middle of the living room floor. Living room was all one room. And that's where everybody took a bath in the same water in front of everybody else. So another incident along their line, when Dad quit the ICS and came home to try to make a go of it on the homestead, we had an agreement with some of the neighbors to break their wild animals running the hills and put collar marks on them so that they would show they were broke animals. Dad and I were working with a whole string of wild mules. Dad was putting a bridle on all the mules out in the open with his halter chain just hanging on the ground, and he was putting a bridle on and off of this mule. And of course the mule's touchy about his ears. And Dad had a W on him. Every time he'd whirled or run out of the way, Dad would just pull up on this W rope and stack him on his head. It's a rope through rings around his middle and down to each front foot. So when you pull that rope, it pulls his feet out from under him. And Dad was trying to get this mule to put into town in the old spring wagon to buy supplies. And Dad and I were working with these mules. All of a sudden, that mule laid his ears back, opened his mouth, and made a lunge at Dad, and got him by the arm. Wintertime, heavy clothes on, and he bit that in the arm to where Dad had the prettiest butterfly on that arm from the teeth of that mule. Some doctor was examining him one day and wanted to know if he'd been vaccinated. Dad says, I don't know. He started pulling up his sleeves, and the doctor saw this butterfly on the muscle of his arm where they pulled the teeth off. The doc says, oh yeah, you've been vaccinated. It was a mule bite he'd been vaccinated with. That's the way we stayed on the homestead for, I've forgotten how many years. From Orland to time we left, they left there somewhere in the early 20s, they left Orland. We moved to Ontario, Oregon in 1934. We then moved to, I've forgotten what year it was, we moved and bought a place in close to town. Nobody had any money. We lived on jackrabbits and cottontails. When the jackrabbits got the sores, we had to go to cottontails and venison. Well, one of the neighbors got visited by a police officer, and he said, your neighbors squealed on you, so he says, I've got to search your place. Where don't you want me to look? That guy searched the place over, and he says, when he asked Corey, don't you want me to look? He says, that little shack down there in the bottom of the canyon. He looked everywhere but there. Never found any meat. So then we moved in to within 3/4 of a mile of Ravendale, into town. A big barn, a big house. That's where we lived for a time. Dad was road and shop foreman for the 5th District. That's where we got started at that, breaking wild mules and building roads. He was working for the county and drawing wages for that, you see. And I remember one trip when I was 15, he took me and 4 head, horses and mules mixed, I think, as I remember. He sent me out with 4 Broncos, 3 Broncos and 1 gentleman to load gravel trucks on a road job. He had 2 cowboys, one driving the team and one handling the Fresno. Dad took me out there and handed it to me all alone. I was alone at it, handling the Fresno and driving the mules too. We got that road gravel. Then, a couple of years after that, we got the job of breaking a whole string of wild mules, and eventually traded for them with the idea of bringing them to Ontario for power. There were tractors in those days. It was my job to get that bunch of wild mules broke. And we were to build a road way out in the hills back of Mount Observation on a sheep camp. They want to make a shearing pen out of it and then haul the wool out. I was assigned the job of building the road to haul the wool out. And I was only 17 years old. Either the summer before or summer after, it had to have been before the fire. We loaded gravel trucks, and then we went to build this road to haul the wool in. Had to break these wild mules to build a road with. And he gave me a swamper, a helper, to operate the grader. The mules were plumb wild, not bridle-wise or anything. I had 2 horses, the old jerk-line lead mare and 1 big gray 4-year-old colt. The rest of them were wild mules. I mean wild ones. 8 head on this grader. And they weren't bridle-wise, you couldn't hold them down. They would just go all of the speed they wanted to go. And you can imagine what happened to that boy on the back end of that grader with that blade angled. Every time he hit a rock, I had to jump sideways, and all he could do to hang on. Well, we kept working at it, and eventually we got the mules worked down to bridle-wise, and you could slow them down and begin to get to work and do things. But the helper he had for me was a boy in Ravendale whose dad had been the supervisor of the road district. This boy had been allowed to get away with his temper. Whenever he didn't like something, he didn't like it pretty bad. One day, they got him one of the first Model A roadsters that come to the country in the early 30s. He went out one day to try to start it. Cold weather, wouldn't start. He run the battery down. So then he went out to the front and the crank, tried to crank it and start it, and cold weather wouldn't start. So I got back in the seat and stuck both feet through the windshield because he was mad. And that's the boy that was my swamper building these roads, running the grader. I think he was a year or 2 older than I. I've forgotten exactly. Gene Godman was his name. Godman had been the supervisor, his dad. So at any rate, we got the road built and got the mules a rough edge off of, and that's the mules we brought to Ontario to move dirt with. While Dad was, we're coming up now to about 33. See, in the fall of 33, Dad and Mother came to Ontario and bought that 80-acre farm, sagebrush. Another hope of having water and following through with Dad's occupation of farm development. Dad was in Ontario with a load of stuff in this little old 1.5-ton Model A truck. It was my job to shoe mules and set wagon tires and get ready to drive that bunch of mules over the road to Ontario. That's the way it was shaping up. When Dad got back, he says, I'll have to haul water to you out around Wagon Tire and Burns, not in that country. He says, I'll have to haul water. If we're going to haul the water, why not haul the mules? Well, that was logical. Mother died in 33. Tommy was after that. This was in December when the fire happened. Then we moved these two homestead cabins, Jim's and ours. Jim was living over around close to Butte School. Jim and Bertha were by this time on a rented place, I think, as I remember. So this is how fire happened on the 4th of December in 1933, after Dad and Mother got back from Ontario, where they had gone and purchased this place. They came up and bought the place. The 3rd of December is when the fire happened. Mother was burned, lived 14 hours as a result of the burns. She poured 5 gallons. She got Bert and Tommy were trying to crank up the old gas engine to get water for her to wash. And she got to thinking, well, if she had some cold water, she could get it hot. And then when they got the pump started, she could go ahead with her washing machine and get the washing done. And that was what was the cause of the fire. Right. She had asthma, and she got a 5-gallon can of what she thought was water, but turned out to be gasoline. And the old Dodge was sitting in the backyard, a radiator water, she thought it was. Poured it in a copper boiler on the kitchen stove, thinking it was water, but it turned out to be gasoline. She turned and went to the front part of the house after pouring this gasoline in the copper boiler on the stove. She turned and went to the front part of the house to get more clothes. She heard the girls scream and she come rushing back. She could have gone out the front door and never been touched, but she knew her girls were in there. Both the girls were in there. Dolly's older than Althea by a few years. Mother, groping around, finally found Althea, wrapped her in her overcoat in the midst of all this flame, this furnace. Well, as pieced together later, Bert and Tommy saw the flame through the glass in the kitchen door, opened the door, and Mother was laying there on the floor with the baby in her overcoat, about 18 months, I think. After she got big enough to talk, why, Dad was questioning her about the fire and one thing and another. And she says that my mama couldn't find me. And Dad says, where were you? She says, I was under the table at a little tot when that blew up, that fire all blew up. It scared her, and she backed under the table. And the gas come down on the table instead of on her. Not as bad as Dolly was, who came through it all later after stuff began to fall from upstairs. Dolly was in the pantry, getting herself and Althea dressed to go out and play in the snow. So after Mother got through there, then Dolly came through it alone in this furnace, this fire. If she'd have thrown a big kettle through the window, she could have got out and not been touched at all. But of course, she was somewhere between 5 and 6 years old, about there. Dad was working in the shop in town. Somebody looked out the window and says, Archie, your house on fire. So they made a run for it and went out there. And Dad said, he told me about it. He said, first thing I thought of was get a blanket to wrap Mother in. Her body was, 2/3 of her body was just charred. And he says he made a run for the house to get a blanket. There was no house or blanket either. It was all up in the flames. Mother only lived 14 hours as a result of this, because so much of her body was charred. And the girls were in the hospital for 3 years with skin grafting from the burns. From McLeod, because that's where Mother's family was at the time. They were in and out of the hospital for 3 years. Dad took the girls back and forth to the hospital for 3 years in San Francisco, where the skin grafting was going on. And later, when they figured they were pretty well done, this lobe of the nose and the lobe of her ear on Dolly were burnt off. And they didn't want to replace them because they said they would remain infant while the rest of her grew. They didn't want to finish the job until she was 16 years of age. Dad and his shuffling back and forth with the hospital in Berkeley and San Francisco, met Alta. And Alta was the girl's nurse. And she wanted to come make a home for him, because she heard the whole story. She was a good friend of Perry's wife. She was the #1 graduate in Berkeley Hospital. Alta Dirk, U-R-K-E. Dad, going back and forth with the girls, met Alta. And she wanted to make a home for those girls. She had never married. So they finally, they kept on corresponding. And eventually, Dad, seeing us boys working out there night and day and doing our own cooking and washing clothes and all this sort of thing. Joy was the mistress of that house at that particular time. So they decided to get married by the correspondence. They kept up the correspondence, decided to get married, and she drove up to John Day. She had a little old Model A coupe. She drove to John Day, and Dad met her. He rode the bus to John Day, and they met in John Day and got married, and then came back. Alta was 40, 50-some years old then when this happened. But she made a home for us. She had some money, I don't recall, around where I got the figure, I don't know, but somewhere around $600 she had in her pocket. She spent every nickel of it on us kids. Tommy could ride a horse real good. In spite of his infantile paralysis, one leg and one arm bothered him, and one eye was larger than the other. He walked with a kind of a shuffle. He was 9 years old or thereabouts. I told him, I says, tonight, I says, you have those stock in off the range so I can turn these mules out off the road job over the weekend and save the hay bill. Hay was a real premium in that country. So he took his pony, little old gray Billy, good little horse. As he went through town, he picked up a city kid who was visiting. I don't even remember the boy's name anymore. They got out in the hills, and each kid wanted their own horse instead of riding double on old Billy. So Tommy took his rope off of old Billy and caught the old jerkline lead mare, old Joy we called her, and caught her and tied this rope around her neck, both ends of the rope, headed the stock off the mountain to go to the ranch. And if you ever run horses, you know that when they're coming into water or something that sort of come 90 miles an hour, really moving. Not really 90 miles an hour, but as fast as they could run downhill. He fell off. He yelled at this city kid to run old Joy into the fence and stop her. All he had was his rope around her neck. And out of control, running with all the horses, and his foot caught in the loop. And she drug him to death. I went back and picked up trinkets out of his pockets. When he hit a sagebrush and that old man was going, his body would be airborne until it got to the next sagebrush or thereabouts, and then it would come down and scoop out a hole. We called the city kid that was with Tommy. When Tommy was drugged to death, laying there on the ground, this kid knew enough to go to town to get somebody. And they got an old war veteran that knew a little bit about CPR. And he went out and found the body, but he was dead. So we severed a bone and a blood vessel here in his neck, bouncing through the sagebrush. So I was making the decisions for the whole family because we were the only ones there was the kids. But we did the best we could. Mother was buried, you see, in Mount Shasta. We knew Tommy would go that same route to Shasta to be buried. And then when we called Dad and told him to meet us in Mount Shasta. So we tried to telephone Dad to meet us in Mount Shasta because that's where the burial would be. But Dad didn't go to Shasta. He didn't know what was going on. He thought if I was involved, Joy was with me. If Bert was involved, probably Tommy was with him. And all this running through Dad's head. He didn't know anything about it. about the accident. And so he came, instead of going to Mount Shasta, as we called him and asked him to do, he got a message, time to come home, he got that much, but no details. So he came back to Ravendale. Then we proceeded to pack up and all of us go to Mount Shasta for the burial. He got there before we left, so we all went together. So then after burying Tommy and the fire in the house gone, we moved that homestead cabin, unpainted one, and Jim's old cabin together into town. As Dad said, let's haul the mules. So we loaded 4 mules and a pinto saddle mare in the back end of this old Model A truck with a factory bed on, which was pretty near a foot narrower than the beds are today. We loaded those mules and that pinto saddle mare all in there crossways. We just pulled out away from the loading dock. The mules had the harness on and the mare had the saddle on. Pulled away from the loading dock, and those mules backing up trying to protect their nose tipped that truck over almost level ground. One of them stuck his hind foot through the top of the cab of the truck and of course did a lot of damage to the rack. So we got another truck. Jim had a truck too. We pulled her back right side up and began to patch the rack and all that sort of thing. But eventually we put one mule crossways and stuck his head through a hole in the wall on the opposite side from where the traffic was. And tied him that way and a pole across, and then tied 3 mules to the pole. But those little old limber springs in that old Model A truck, 1.5 tons, every chuck hole and every rock in the road, you just knew it was going to tip over again. Jim and I were traveling together. He had a truck. His wasn't a factory bed. So the 2 trucks, most of the time we traveled together. But I made 20 trips as a 17-year-old kid moving stuff. And pumped those tires up 80 pounds of pressure by hand with a hand pump. Put a boot in the tire and boot it up and then pump them up by hand. 48 hours to a trip, 1 night's sleep, another 48 hours to a trip. Never stopped. 30 miles an hour was really moving. Sometimes going downhill you'd make 45. But the roads were so bad and chuck holes and rocks and all that you still couldn't drive full speed. Out across Wagon Tire and Burns and across that desert. Just dirt road, dirt and gravel road. Just follow your nose. No, nothing like what we've got today. Then after we got here to Ontario, the Waihe project was in the process of being built. We figured on working on the ditches and the roads and all with the mules. That was the power we were bringing with us. That's the reason for the mules. To level their own land and let it work out with the mules too. We had one good job up west of Nissa on the Highline Ditch that had 2 big gates in the main canal. And those gates were big enough to drive 4 mules in a Fresno through either one of them, because I did it. And scoot dirt with a Fresno off the edge of the mountain, and then had another team of mules on a 300-foot cable across the canyon, pulling that dirt in around this big concrete structure, which was nothing but a safety measure in case the ditch broke down below. They could shut all the water off and shoot it down this canyon. So I put in the dirt for tamp backfill around that emergency structure in Lockett Gulch in 1935. Then Roosevelt said no. After the crash of 29, he was trying to get people to stay home, to get traveling all over the country, stay put. They finally shut us off. They wouldn't let us work anymore unless we'd lived here 6 months. Well, that hit us right between the eyes. We hadn't been here 6 months. And the 2 funerals and the fire behind us, when they wouldn't let us work the mules, we had to sell the mules. We couldn't afford to buy hay for them and not work them. Took in every outlaw the neighbors had and a load of hay for breaking him. That's the way we got our work done. Dolly went through high school, as did Althea in Ontario. Dolly was scarred real bad, and the fire much worse than Althea was. She taught school for 25 years with a personality that you didn't see the scars when you got acquainted with her. I never felt that Dad got over Mother's death. I never felt that he did. It was always a real burden to him. Then Tommy, we see 2 deaths in the fire, so we didn't have any furniture to move. Roosevelt shut us off from the work, so we had to sell the mules. Dolly married Gene Wolfe in Portland. Althea married Jim Holbrook in Ontario. Bert married Helen Trinkle, and later married Artis. Most all of them are gone by now. Only a few of us left.